Be Frank Network. Content on this production is for entertainment and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, nor is it intended to substitute medical treatment or diagnosis. Seek medical help if you believe that you are suffering from a mental illness or are a threat to yourself or others. By using any or all of the information provided, you do so at your own risk. Any application of the material is at the listener's discretion and is his or her sole responsibility.
Everybody, Doc Brian here, and welcome to Doc Talks, where we talk about people's troubles, trials, tribulations, and hopefully triumphs in life. Today I have with me Michaela McAllister. Did I say that right?
McAllister.
McAllister.
Yeah.
Like the deli. McAllister's
Yes.
Deli. Okay. And she is here to share with us her story. And I'm come in contact with you through the Arkansas Foster and Adopt support page. Is that where we got in contact?
Yes, I have a good family friend of mine, Jan Park. She's on that page, and she sent me your request and kind of flagged it for me to see if I would be interested in it. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, we're glad to have you. And my son is adopted, so we have been through the whole, which I call a broken system. And so it's always encouraging to hear other people's stories and how everything worked out for them. So tell us, were you born here in Central Arkansas? Where were you born?
Yes, I was born in Benton, raised in Benton, Saline County.
All right. And Saline County is the county you do not want to speed through because you will get a ticket. That's right?
Really?
Oh, you don't know that.
I'd say the North Little Rock police up here are a little harsher.
Well, maybe you just shouldn't speed. Maybe that's the thing. So growing up there, what was life like growing up in Benton?
I kind of have my life kind of mapped out from like age stages because it was so drastically different at times. Just from growing up in a world where there were a lot of drugs and a lot of abuse, and then getting into the foster care system. So I guess we could is it okay if we kind of go through it like that?
Sure. So what's the earliest memory that you have?
My earliest memory, it's so funny how memory and trauma work together.
Mhm.
It really is. And I've been with several therapists just kind of mapping that out in my brain. People who haven't experienced a lot of trauma in their childhood, like the things they remember, like the name of their first grade teacher, like just little stuff like that, completely blank for me, completely blank. But I have these memories of trauma that have replaced them because that's how my brain has prioritized things. So my earliest memories, that's how I associate with my mother. My mother, she kind of dropped out of my life when I was around 5. My dad got full custody of me. So my earliest memories are kind of with my mom. She was around 19 when she had me, and she was addicted to drugs, and so was my father at the time. And so they had just a really hard time when they first had me, financial struggles and social struggles, just everything put together. I do have some good memories, like I have memories of playing outside with my brother, or we would go and we would pick blackberries on the bushes outside of our house.
Yeah.
And as I've gotten older, I've learned how to really associate my memories and like what was really going on, like create a narrative. Because when you're young, you don't understand a lot of what's going on.
Absolutely.
As I got older, I realized, we were picking blackberry bushes while we were walking to the drug dealer's house. So, like those things kind of start to click for you. But there's kind of this narrative that children don't really understand drug abuse or don't really understand abuse in general. But that is so false. Children have hearts as well. They know what's going on. They can feel the energy. They can feel, strained relationships. And so I had a pretty good understanding of everything that was happening when I was younger. What are some memories? I remember when I was probably 3 or 4, I fell down a couple steps, and my mother asked me if I would pretend that my arm was broken so that she could take me to the hospital and get opioids.
Oh, wow.
And, I remember the police outside of my house arresting my parents. I remember being in Walmart, standing outside of the bathroom stall for hours while my mother was using drugs in the bathroom. And, I might have not known that she was shooting heroin, but I knew
It
that
wasn't
she was doing.
normal.
It wasn't normal. She was doing something wrong.
So you mentioned a brother. Is he a younger brother than I assume?
Yes, he is a younger brother. He is about 3 years younger than me.
Okay.
Hmm.
So growing or being born into a family where there's drugs, was there any type of reactive attachment or alcohol syndrome that you now know of that was there for you?
See, I'm not really sure for me. My parents swear by the book that my mother did not do hard drugs when she was pregnant with me. I don't know how true that is.
Mhm.
I know that she smoked marijuana. I know that she smoked cigarettes and all those things when she was pregnant with me. But I haven't really been affected by it. My brother has ADHD,
Mhm.
and that may be a symptom. But, you know, honestly, I think it's just a miracle
Mhm.
that I am the way that I am. Not like that I'm not, disabled or that I don't have
Sure.
some kind of, severe psychological issues, because knowing the amount of drugs that my parents were ingesting at that age, I'm sure there was something going on.
Yeah. And you mentioned it's funny how our brain categorizes trauma and
Mhm.
that we remember certain bits and pieces and then as we get older we look back and go, that was traumatic. But
Mhm.
we in those moments we just kind of remember the good things. And that's one of the problems with people that face trauma as children is when they get older, sometimes these feelings manifest out of nowhere, and now you're left to deal with what is going on around you that you may not even really remember.
Mhm.
And then going into therapy and really talking through, life and going back and recalling these memories, just like you said, you realize all of a sudden that's not normal.
Yeah.
That's not what should have been happening. There is no good explanation for why your mother would turn around and ask you, "Should we run or should we stop?"
Mhm.
And so it's kind of it really is unique, I guess is the best word of how our brain just packets some of those memories in different ways. So as now you're growing up, your brother is with you. Did you have another sibling?
I did have a sister when I was younger. She was about 10 months younger than me, but she died when she was an
Mhm.
infant. When she was about 10 months old, she passed away.
Okay. Was it like natural causes? Do you know?
It was SIDS. She passed away
Okay.
in her crib. That was the first experience that I kind of had with the foster care system and with DHS, because after my sister passed away, there was an investigation on my parents to try to figure out what happened. And, at that time, my brother and I were staying with my aunt, my mom's sister. And so that was really the first experience I had. But because we were in that kind of kinship and we were able to stay with someone who was close to us, and because I was so young, I don't really remember it very well.
Right.
That's a really important piece of my story because of the way that it impacted my parents. When my sister passed away, it was extremely hard for both of my parents. I can only imagine what it feels like to lose a child. It kind of had a different effect on each of my parents. Seeing my sister pass away took my mother to an even darker place, to a really, really hard place. And that's when her drug problem became uncontrollable. And then for my father, I don't know the whole narrative because I was so young, but I think that that was kind of a wake up call for him in some way, that he needed to be better for his kids and to kind of start to get back on track.
I can't imagine losing a child and I don't want to imagine how that must feel, but any type of major traumatic life event, most time we get to choose, okay, am I going to really let this kind of wake me up and, try to do better? Or am I just going to kind of go into a deep, dark depression and not get any help and just keep going down? And it sounds like your mother, which she already had drug problems to begin with,
Mhm.
that she just kind of let that take her down. You mentioned that you were kinship placed with an aunt.
Mhm.
Now, in the state of Arkansas, and I don't know how it is in other states, but in the state of Arkansas, we have kinship placement. But in order to be placed with a kin folk, which is where that terminology comes, that child must have had regular interaction with that person. There are many judges now in the state of Arkansas that will not allow kinship placements because there is no guarantee that the parent or the abuser will not be allowed to be with them because the kinship placement is family. How do you feel about that?
I think that it's absurd to assume that because one person in the family has a drug problem, everyone is going to fall to these standards. My aunt, she was a really positive influence in my life. And the only reason that I wasn't with her long term is because she didn't want to be halfway into motherhood. She could have been my mom. She could have adopted me. She could have raised me, but she would always have her sister. That's my kid. That's
Hmm.
my kid. So I can see why it can be kind of a sticky situation, but I think it's better to put a child in a situation that they're familiar with.
Sure, absolutely. So you mentioned how your mother just kind of got darker in
Mhm.
a worse place. Did she resolve from that, or did it just or she come back and be worse, or what transpired there with your mother at that point?
I think honestly, I don't know if it was more of her going into a darker place or more of my dad getting out of it. Because what ended up happening is shortly after my sister died, my parents divorced and there was a custody battle. And then my dad got full custody of me. When I was around 5 years old, is when I stopped having contact with my mother until my teen years when I wanted to reach out to her and see how she was doing. So, I had absolutely no contact after this certain amount of time. Any kind of coping mechanism, whether it's you're addicted to drugs or you're addicted to alcohol or you're addicted to eating, you can be addicted to just about anything. You're trying to numb. You're
Mhm.
trying to numb those feelings instead of go through them. And when you have this base layer of trauma and then, you have a bad relationship and you make some bad decisions there's more trauma. And this trauma just keeps building and building and building until it's a skyscraper. And that's why it's so hard for people to get off of drugs is because when you stop numbing it, you don't get to just face that skyscraper, punch it, and then it'll go away. You have to go layer by
Right.
layer by layer. And so with every layer there is, it's harder. It puts you in situations where you're more susceptible to more trauma.
Yeah, addicts typically they quit because they have to, not
Mhm.
because they really want to. And, as I tell people, those that are alcoholics or drug users, it's only numb when you're high, or it's only numb when you're drunk. And if you stay drunk or high all the time, you have no quality of life. And more often than not, they're making everybody else around them just as miserable as they are.
My parents, they were very off and on, off and on, off and on. And what happened was I went back with, I think my mom had primary custody at the time, and then it was joint custody. Later, my dad wanted full custody and then took my mom to court for full custody.
Do you recall any of that back and forth between your mom and dad in the court? And did you have to go to court and testify? There's a lot of things that surround custody hearings.
For a while, it was my dad had met a new woman. And so it was, he was with her, and then he was with my mom, and then he was with her, and then he was with my mom. And it was kind of back and forth for a while until eventually everything was final with my mom, and he was with her primarily. And that's when the custody battle really heated up, and my mom started to lose custody. You know, especially when it's a mother, it's hard to take a child away completely from their parent. It's really hard to get full custody as a father. It's
Absolutely.
extremely
It's
hard.
it's rare.
Yes,
Very rare.
very rare. But I would come to my dad's house with lice. He would
Mhm.
fix it. I'd go back and come back to my dad's house with lice. I'd be sleeping at random people's houses while my mom was partying. There was a lot there against her, and my dad was kind of starting to get more stable while she was still in the mix of it.
Yeah. Not a couple of weeks ago, I was at Walmart out on McCain and was buying some things, and I saw, which there's a police officer there all the time,
Mhm.
and the loss prevention was escorting this lady, and she had a son with her, I assume, that he may have been 5 years old. And they arrested her for shoplifting. And I'm going, if you're going to shoplift, at least leave your kid somewhere,
Yeah.
and but to me, I can't even fathom that
hmm
I can't fathom that I would shoplift, let alone that I would do it with my 6-year-old with me to do that. But it sounds like that even before the split up, that your mother was doing those kind of things. She was involving you and presumably your brother along with these antics that she was
Oh,
doing.
yeah. I remember she'd have me squeeze through the window of a house to break into it.
Oh my goodness.
Pull the window up with a credit card. I squeeze through and go unlock the door for her.
I can't even imagine. So now your dad has custody.
hmm
You move in completely, I guess, with your father. Is that where the communication stopped with your mom?
But that's around the time I stopped communication with my mom. What ended up
Right.
happening is
Sure, sure.
slowly my dad started to get primary custody. I want to say around 5 or 6 is when my dad got full custody, and then I stopped seeing my mom. I think it was 11 years before I ever contacted her again. My dad was very adamant about keeping her away.
For good reason,
Yeah,
it
for good.
sounds.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
good reasons. I know that she would come and try to bring us presents, and he would say no, like go away, or she'd try to call us. And what happened, especially for my mother, I think, is she was just kind of mentally stunted when she started doing drugs. And so, even though she was getting older and having kids and getting married, she was still in the mindset of a 13-year-old. That was around the time that she was completely shut out of my life, and it was just dad and then new stepmom.
But it wasn't something that your dad said, hey, you're not going to talk to her anymore. Or did it start with her just not calling and connecting, and then your dad was protecting you from that?
I'm not sure exactly how the whole story goes. They both have different narratives. They both have different narratives on just about anything.
Right. Now you're full custody with your dad. You have a stepmother
Mhm.
now. Did you have then step siblings?
I had a stepbrother.
Okay.
Yes,
Was he older or younger?
he was older. He's about 3 years older than me.
Okay. And what was that like?
During the custody battle and everything was kind of moving smoothly. They ended up getting married, and then she adopted my brother and I. So we were like legally all a family. She was my mom.
hmm
And so it was kind of like we were a family unit. My name was changed. They changed my middle name. And, I
So
had,
not just your last name, they changed your middle name?
yeah, they changed my middle name.
Was there an association to that name with your mother?
My stepmom wanted all of her kids to have their middle names start with the letter R. She changed the spelling of my first name as well.
And how old were you then?
I was about 7.
Wow.
Yeah. So they got married. My
It's a
name was
little
changed.
narcissistic a little bit.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
Yeah.
But so they changed my whole name. She was my new mom. She adopted me. And we were like to the outside world, perfect little family. Everything was legally put together. And for a little bit, it went well. But then as I got older, there was a lot of resentment towards me from my stepmom. And this is kind of the part of my story that I see as being the most traumatic. A lot of times with kids, it's really hard to express psychological and emotional abuse. We don't give kids the tools to
Mhm.
express those things.
Yeah.
The best I could articulate as a child what was happening in my home is that my mommy's mean to me.
Mhm.
I couldn't articulate the fact that I was being abused. She was probably the hardest part of my story. And we talked about this just a minute ago, the things that you kind of filter out when you're a kid because you feel the emotions. You feel whether or not you're loved, whether or not someone's there. You don't see, hey, my mom's running away from the cops. We could get shot right now. You
Yeah.
see, hey, I'm hanging out with my mom having a good time. In some ways, I would say that my relationship with my stepmom was even more abusive than my relationship with anyone else.
And you talked about as children, we're not really given the tools to recognize emotional trauma.
Mhm.
And one thing that we do with adolescents is, well, how do you feel? What do you feel like? Well, they have no idea.
Mhm.
because what they're trying to do is tell you what they're supposed to feel like, not what they actually feel like. And so what happens is that the therapists try to say things like, well, tell me what your favorite all-time movie is. And, mention anything from Frozen to Snow White, to whatever movie. And then we will ask them, at what point in that movie did you feel like the character felt the way you feel right now? And when they're able to associate that, then they can communicate. Not sure, which I don't want to spill the beans, but you being a school teacher, you
Hmm.
know that behaviors are words, that the kids are trying to tell you something in these behaviors. It's not just, hey, I'm going to be rude because I want to be rude. There is a reason behind everything that we do. And so, yeah, I, and I don't know the answer to
Hmm.
that. I do know with my son, I don't know if you've seen them. They were popular on TikTok for a while. They're the octopus and they're a smiley face, and then you turn them inside out and they're a sad face.
Yeah, I've seen those.
So he got one of those, and if he's not happy, he'll flip it over, and I'm going, okay, that's good that you can recognize that you're not happy. However, we need to talk about why you're not happy. It's not just enough to flip a switch and say, oh yeah, well, he's mad. We've got to have that conversation about why. And I think so many times as children that just gets looked over. And I really think that for one, it gets looked over in the home because most parents nowadays were taught, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. And we're just kind of pushed to the side. And in schools, schools are so understaffed that I don't think that a lot of that attention is given where it needs to be given. We have these raw emotions and we don't know what to do with them. And
Hmm.
I'm sure that's the way you felt. And maybe, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but maybe at some point you felt like that was normal. Like this
Hmm.
abuse that you were getting was what you're supposed to be getting.
When I was younger, a lot of it, my stepmom would pit me and my father against each other.
So how did that affect your and your dad's relationship?
Well, my dad and I really didn't have much of a relationship for a lot of my childhood. He was there, he lived in the home, but he worked constantly. And, my stepmom tried her hardest to keep us away from each other.
So you have a mother who is obsessive in a narcissistic dependent way, and then there are some traumas that take place, some abuse that takes place that ultimately ends with DHS removing you from the home.
So what happened, I stayed in that home for a while, and there was some other instances, and it really just started to get bad. Their relationship was never great. They fought a lot. When they would fight, she would come to me and, this is your fault. We're fighting about you. Everything's your fault.
Whether they were or not.
Whether they were or not, yeah. And so they were kind of on the brink of getting a divorce. And it's easier to remember that period of time in my life because I was starting to get older. I was about to turn 10, 11, 12. This is what's going on in these years. And so I remember I would be in my room and late at night, the 700 Club would come on.
Mhm.
And I remember listening to all these amazing stories of people who were in terrible situations and pray about it and God will get you out, and pray about it and God would get you out. So, from that period on, I will say I probably have prayed every single night of my life.
Mm.
I remember just like pleading, like, God, help me. What is wrong with me? Like, help me get out of this situation. I don't know what to do. And so that's where I was. I was scared of my stepmom. I was scared of my brother. I was scared of my dad because he would have outbursts, and I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Mm.
When I turned a little bit after I turned 12, he and my dad and my stepmom got a divorce. That's when we kind of exited that situation. What ended up happening is we reversed the adoptions. My brother and I were under full custody of my dad. And
I've
then
never heard of that happening.
you've never heard of that?
Never heard of a
No, that is
reverse.
possible. You can reverse adoptions.
Wow.
So we reversed the adoptions on both sides. My stepbrother was hers now, and we were my dad's. And it's kind of funny because we only had my dad on our birth certificates because my mom, her rights had been terminated.
Right.
And then my stepmom reversed the adoption. So now we just had dad on the birth certificate. But my dad moved directly into another relationship. So there was another woman involved immediately.
So it would be safe to say there was a lot of identity crisis going on without even realizing there's an identity crisis going on of who am I?
Right.
And with your stepmom constantly berating you, you thinking, well, I feel this way, but she says I'm this way. And so I could only imagine there was a constant internal conflict as to what you were supposed to do, not just who you were supposed to be, but what you're supposed to do.
I've had that internal dialogue since as far as I can remember, struggling with what am I supposed to do? What's the right thing to do? I never do the right thing, like just constant.
Do you carry that as an adult?
In some situations of my life, in a few situations, yeah.
So now you're with your dad into your grandparents' home. What transpires there?
This was a very weird point in my life because my dad hadn't been in a close relationship with me for almost my entire childhood because, we had the stepmom dominating over everything. And this new relationship with my dad, it felt awesome. I was a little confused at first over whether or not to feel bad, but then it quickly transitioned into, well, my dad's moved on to a new woman. So, I don't have to feel bad anymore. So she was out of my life. I was still dealing with the trauma, of course, but they were completely out of my life. And I started to feel what it was kind of like to be a normal person. My dad enrolled me in a new school. And so it felt really good for a while. Friends were able to come over to my house, which I thought was absolutely crazy. Because I just assumed I couldn't do anything. I never asked for anything because the answer was always no. So, I was like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. Like my life is totally different now. Started hanging out with friends and started getting interested in boys and everything was great for a while until I realized that it wasn't. What ended up happening was they were together for about a year before things started going downhill. And my dad took a 6-month period off of work because his best friend was diagnosed with cancer. And this was my uncle. We grew up with him. We went on fishing trips all the time. He didn't have anyone else really to take care of him. And so we were relying on my stepmom's cosmetology checks while my dad was taking care of his best friend. And he passed away, and my dad relapsed on drugs. And then he and my stepmom got divorced because he was starting to get back into the drugs. So he just lost his best friend. He relapsed, and then now he's divorced, and he turned into a completely different person. And so in the middle of the night, I snuck out of my house so my dad wouldn't hear me. I was terrified that he was going to hear me. Snuck out of my house, waited in the police car for hours for the detective to show up, gave my testimony to the detective, and then after that, they pulled my brother and I from the house, and then it was heading on our journey to foster care.
So now going into your foster home, your first foster home, what was that like, being in a whole new world, presumably?
It was really, really weird. I remember, 14-year-old girl, the first thing she thinks is, well, I had plans to go shopping with my friend tomorrow. And now my friend is not going to know what happened to me. Like, she's going to have no idea. They took us both, and I was shocked at the time. And then that's when it started to hit me, like, I just made a decision that's going to impact my entire family. Like, it hadn't hit me before then. But when they started walking my brother out of the house, I was like, oh, crap. I just did something big. Like, I just changed my life. They get us in the car. They get us to the police department. And, you want to talk about the broken system for a little bit. There's a lot of things broken about the system. But I remember we stayed the night in the police department. And then... Which is not uncommon. Not uncommon, no.
At all.
Not uncommon. But the next day, we had to wait for the social worker to come pick us up. And the social worker, first thing they did was took us to the hospital to do an exam. And the abuse that I had described to the detective, my social worker just said right in front of my brother, just spilled all the beans about every detail of what had just happened right in front of my younger brother, who's 12. And I was like, are you kidding me, lady? Like, are you serious? That is so inappropriate. But I could tell she was just annoyed that she had to be up that early, honestly. But they took us to the DHS office, and I remember sitting there while she phone call after phone call after phone call after phone call. Can you take these 2 kids? No. Okay, bye. Can you take these 2 kids? Okay, 14, 12. No. Okay, bye. Just constant. No, 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 no. And, you know, like I've said before, some things you don't really realize that are wrong until you're older. It's like, I would not want my child sitting there hearing that. Just, I'm not going to accept you. I'm not going to accept you. I'm not going to accept you. And what ended up happening is they got a hold of a family and they said, we'll take the girl, but we're not going to take the boy. When they came to pick me up, they realized, okay, well, the boy has nowhere else to go. So they went ahead and took my brother with me for short term, is what it was supposed to be. And, I remember like going to the call house in Saline County. Do you know much about the call?
I do.
Yeah. So I remember going to the call house and we picked out clothes because we had nothing. I was in my short pajama shorts. I remember being so embarrassed because I was meeting all these people in these really short shorts that I had worn as pajamas. But we went and got all of that. And then our direct transition was, okay, a really super traumatic experience to, okay, come to my house. We're having a birthday party today for my son, and there's a bunch of kids here, and we got a bouncy house. And so it was definitely a culture shock, to say the least.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with the call is an adoption coalition here in Arkansas, and what you're referring to is a call mall, which has clothes, it has toys, it has bassinets and cribs and anything that a foster parent might need for a foster child who is coming into their care. And we are certainly blessed to have them here in Arkansas. And I think there's a call in every county in Arkansas except for 3. So they've sure reached out. Now, just the sitting there with the social worker and hearing person after person saying, no, we can't take them. That's enough trauma for anybody to really have some even complex PTSD with everything that you've been through. But now in the foster system, did you again feel like your identity had changed?
After a while, yes. At first, no. I had 2 foster homes. I was very, very, very fortunate. My brother did not get so lucky. He did not get so lucky.
So they weren't able to keep you together.
They were not. But in my first foster home, I was still very, very, very so much attached to my identity from when I was living at home because it was, and they were nervous. They had never had a foster kid before. And foster care has a lot of rules.
It does.
Rules that you do not even think about.
It does.
Like me being, a 15-year-old girl, I can't go to a football game because I might see a family member.
Right.
I can't go anywhere, unsupervised. I can't have a cell phone.
Right.
Because I might contact a family member. And, for the first year and a half, I can't cut my hair because my dad didn't give permission.
Right.
For the first year and a half, I still knew I was very much so attached to that identity of where I had grown up. And, I was with them for a year and a half. And when you're with a family for that long, you really get attached every single day, holidays and everything, and they had 3 kids and they were all precious and I adored them. But, there started to be some problems more towards the end, just with, they weren't prepared to take in a case where they're going to have a teenager long term, and their kids were all younger. But what ended up happening is I was old enough that I could say what I wanted to do. They asked me.
So at that point you were 16?
15 to 16,
Okay.
yes. And so they asked me straight up, what do you want? And I said, I don't care as long as I'm not with my dad. I had gone through some trauma in those last few months that I was with him, and I could not see at all me functioning in that household. And so immediately from the beginning, I said, no way. I'm not going back. But for my brother, it was different because he didn't experience the abuse that I did. And that's kind of where I started to see the separation of us two. When you're in foster care, they give the parents about a year is typical. They give you all the different standards you have to meet, rehab, anger management, therapy, all those different things. And you either do them or you don't. And my dad didn't. He did not. And he ended up losing custody. He lost his parental rights. And so after that, it was me finding a new identity in myself. I'm going to get through. I'm going to get through this. And I'm going to go to college. And, that was my plan. My plan had nothing to do with anything family. I'm done with family. I'm over it. There's nothing good comes out of that. My brother, he ended up getting reunified with my dad's mom, my grandmother. I did not feel comfortable staying there because I knew that my dad was going to be there. Just like you were talking about earlier with Ken.
Right.
I didn't want to be there. I did not want to be around my father. And so after being in several placements, my brother was put into the care of my grandmother, and I was still in care. I was still in foster care.
Now, you mentioned, you said you decided you were going to go to college and that family was bad. You were just going to stay away from family. Statistically, in the U.S., there are around 400,000 kids in foster care at any given point in time. And of those kids, when they either emancipate out of the system or they age out of the system, they're a very high percentage that either get on drugs, are in prison, have children at a very young age, and then just kind of restart this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that you had that enough wherewithal at 15, 16 years old that you were going to do it different?
Because I knew the day that I stepped into my first kindergarten class that this was going to be the way out. I had searched and searched and searched all around my life to try to find something to get me out. And I knew the only way was to do well in that kindergarten class, to make my teacher happy, and to go to college. I knew that was the only way. I always overachieved in school, mostly because, and I counted one time, I went to like 11 different elementary schools.
Oh, wow.
I found stability in my teachers. They were the ones they were always going to show up to school. They were always going to be fair about discipline. They were always going to grade my work and not manipulate what I said. And so I found coping through school. And
the structure.
Yes, the structure.
You knew what was going to happen.
And I liked the compliments when I did well. You're smart. I got tested for GT in the second grade. And after that, it was like a big ego boost to a second grader, but it felt good.
And then you go home and get knocked back down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I knew from a very early age, I always overachieved in school because I recognized that as an escape. That was my escape route. And
so was it that you had determined you were going to go to college, or that you were going to go to college to become a teacher because that was a safe place?
I knew I was going to go to college.
Okay.
I knew I was going to go to college, get a degree, and make some money and not be living paycheck to paycheck.
But you're a teacher, so you're living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, we can talk about that later.
So you say, okay, look, this is what I've got to do if I'm going to be successful. I know where my safe place is. I've got to get there, which speaks volumes about your ability to cope. Because a lot of children in that situation wouldn't be looking for the safe place. They would just shut down, or they would act out in other ways. And so when you made that determination and now you're in foster care, what happens next? Where do you go from there? Are you waiting to just graduate high school, or are you looking for adoption?
I was not looking for adoption. I was looking to graduate. I was looking to get out. And things did start to change once my dad's rights were terminated, because then it was like, okay, the foster family I was living with realized, okay, she's not going home, and I think that kind of started to have a little crisis there. Because like I said, they were not ready for a teenager who needed a permanent home, at least until I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
And so there ended up being some problems because, you raise a teenager differently than you raise a 9-year-old.
Sure.
There's got to be some more, independence, and they weren't ready to take on the load of a whole nother child, because like their children in my foster home, they were dance kids. It was, dance tournament and dance recitals, and they didn't feel comfortable leaving me at home. So, every day after school, I was sitting at dance practice for 2 hours. On the weekends, I was going to Tulsa and sitting in the dance tournaments, like I was there in it. But, when it came to what I wanted to do, I didn't feel like it was prioritized. I would not label myself as like a confrontational person or someone who has had like erratic behavior or anything. But like I said, my needs were not being met, and it's okay that they couldn't meet my needs, and they would get frustrated and I would get frustrated. And then me and my foster mom were fighting. And so, we had some confrontation, and we've talked about it since I've left her home. And I think we both recognize what was going on. But, when you're in a home for a year and a half, you get attached to these people.
Sure. And so when they moved you out of that foster home, did they move you to a pre-adoptive home, or did you go to another foster home?
What ended up happening is it was a miracle that I even got in a home.
Mm-hmm.
They had another...
Yeah, at that age, it's hard.
Yeah. They had another home lined out for me, and then there were some problems, and my old foster mom had expressed concern to new foster mom, so that didn't end up lining out. And so my next step was going to be a homeless shelter or a group home. That was my next step, which was really frustrating because I was running for student class president at my high school.
So they were at the point of emancipation.
They were, yeah, it was, we're not in an adoptive state at that point. They don't want me to, I had already expressed, I don't want to be adopted. It's fine. I'm fine. I just want to go to school. That's it. And I was like, and preferably I want to go to school here at this high school, because I had built roots, and I had, built myself up in a way, like I have references. Like that's, a lot of people think of college and, I should write some I needed to write those scholarship essays. I needed it. And so my priority at the time was, I want to stay in my high school. I don't want to go to another high school. So what happened was the leader of the call in Saline County, her name is Julia Descarpentry. She is an amazing woman. She reached out to a family, a local family that she knew was fostering, and asked them if they would take me. And they did. And so I moved into that home. And
so you went to this family's home that was referred from the call.
Yes.
And you were presumably there to be a foster until you aged out. But you were adopted.
I was adopted.
And how did that all transpire?
I went in there and I was on edge. I had just had a really hard weekend. I felt like a terrible person. Like my foster parents hated me. Like I was in limbo. Nobody knew what to do with me. And I remember walking into the kitchen, and my mom now was just like, "Hey, what's up?" And, I hadn't seen that kind of positivity in a while. And I start trying to explain myself, because I'm sure she knows everything. And I don't need to know that. I don't need to know anything about what happened before you walked in this door. You don't have to tell me anything. Here's your room. Let's get you set up. Sorry, I'm going to tear up. But I had never experienced that before. I had never had somebody tell me, "Hey, I don't care what has happened. You don't have to explain yourself. You are a person and you are valid, and I'm going to take care of you no matter what." And yeah, it was.
And that's so liberating.
Yeah.
But at the same time, scary.
Yeah. And so I started living there, and I started kind of like, testing and to see kind of how the relationships were going to go. And it's so funny because, they were all in the same town. Everybody knew everybody. And so they had heard about me. My brother now had heard about me. He was friends with my old foster sister. And so he was hearing stories about me. And they tell me now, like, they were a little skittish at first just because they had heard stories. But after being with me for a month, they were like, okay, y'all are crazy. There's nothing wrong with this girl. She's fine. I stayed there. And I knew I have learned over the years how to put my smiley face on, how to put my head up and get through. And that was my plan when I got there. They took me to get my driver's license. And that was a big deal for me because my old foster family didn't want to teach me how to drive. They said I could get a job. And that was a big deal for me because, heck yeah, I need to start saving up money for college. So I remember she just asked me what I needed at this time. And what I needed was to start to become independent. I was 16, about to turn 17 at this time. And it was, I need to get a driver's license. I need to get a job. And it was, okay, let's do it. Not, I don't want to share my car with you. Or I don't want to have to take you to work every day because there's dance practice after school. It was, okay, let's do it.
Yeah. And so that kind of gave you that family structure that you're supposed to have. How did the conversation come about for adoption?
Well, I had lived there for about a year and I was about to go to college. I had been accepted to colleges. I had started to get some scholarships and I was on my way out. I was picking out my dorm and, about to leave. And I remember sitting in church in my youth group at the time. We had little Bible study meetings in the morning for your grade and your gender. So it was all senior girls. And I remember, my leaders asking about what are your concerns about going to college? How are you feeling about it? And I just thought about it for a second. I said, where do I go on Christmas? Can I stay there? Can I stay at my dorm in Christmas, or are they going to kick me out? And I think my youth group leader had a conversation with my foster parents, and weeks later they had sat me down and they said, you're part of the family now. Like you're welcome here whenever, like always. And I was like, I really appreciate that. And they eventually they were like, well, we want to ask you a question. Would it be okay if we adopted you? And I really, really appreciated that. I appreciated that they asked me because, and a lot of situations, I think foster kids are kind of seen as like, that's the number one thing. That's all they want. They just, that's what they need. They need you. And they met me eye to eye. I see you. I know what you're doing. I know that you have other plans in your life. Is it okay if you join our family? And I said yes. And then I remember they called down my brother and sister and they were so excited. They were like, yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to have a sister. It's a cool story because they got to adopt me the day before I graduated high school. The day before I graduated high school. And my mom talked to my principal because, I was going to change my name. And my principal agreed to call my name because it hadn't been changed yet. He agreed to call my name as Michaela Bond when I got my diploma. And so that was really special.
Yeah, I'm going to get emotional here. I'm not supposed to do this, but wow, just what a story of grace receiving that you didn't even know you deserved or needed. That there was this family who was just open to step up and fill in the gap and love you. What would you say to people who may be listening today or children that may be listening that are currently in foster care? What would you say to them?
I love my mom and dad. They are not the only family I gained out of this experience. I gained family through the transporter who drove me back and forth to visitations with my brother. I gained family through the woman who was in charge of the call and saw my struggle and saw what I needed. I gained family through the person who's in charge of the independent living students and who helped me like apply for scholarships and apply for college and go pick out stuff for my dorm. I gained family through the other foster kids who I had these classes with. Talk about an identity crisis. I have gone from one life to a completely different other life. And I'm still sometimes stuck in the middle because, like you were talking about earlier, if someone connects to my childhood and connects to my past, odds are, most kids who go through that, they either get pregnant at a young age or they fall to drugs or they get in these situations. And then, people who are typically in my place of life, they haven't experienced the things that I've experienced. But I think it's more than just what we have in common. I think it's those emotions that you feel. And if you can connect to people because of the emotions that they have, that's what's important.
And you're not alone.
Here's one thing that I really want to emphasize too. When I was 9 years old watching the 700 Club and praying on my knees desperately that God would help me, I thought, oh, there's no way he's going to help me because he didn't do it the next day.
Mm-hmm.
But he helped me. He helped me because he had Julia Descarpentry working for the call.
Mm-hmm.
He was setting up a place in my parents' heart for me. He was putting together things before I could ever imagine. And prayers aren't answered the next day, but they will be answered.
Yeah.
And I think, sorry.
You're fine.
You're fine. One of the most important things.
I'm going to have to find the Kleenex in a minute if you keep going. But please do. Please do.
The most important thing, too, especially in the foster care system, especially going through trauma, what happens to you is not who you are.
Mm.
How you react to what happens to you is who you are.
Absolutely.
If you react with grace, you're going to get grace. If you react with persistence, you're going to get persistence. If you're in a group home and the people in the group home are not treating you right, are you going to react by being tougher and harder and beating one up and catching a charge at 14? Or are you going to react by showing love to them?
Mm.
And I've noticed that a lot too, because, God knows I've had some reactions that were less than perfect, but the reactions are what make you who you are.
Yeah. I find myself often saying your diagnosis is not your identity, and what you have done doesn't make who you are. As there are some of us that have a colorful past, but we're not those people. We did those things, but my past doesn't define me. Who I am today defines who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So to tell the rest of your story, you graduated from college.
I did.
You're with a history degree?
I have a social studies history degree. So I'll be teaching 8th grade social studies next year, U.S.
Gotcha.
history.
And you recently married.
Mm-hmm, I did.
And so looking back today, would you have ever imagined at 15, 16 years old that you would be doing what you're doing today?
Absolutely.
And I think that's the key,
Mm-hmm.
is that we don't give up, that we have a plan, that we know what we want to do. But in so many cases, foster kids are just so beat down
Mm-hmm.
and they're so emotionally abused, maybe not even meaning to be by foster parents,
Mm-hmm.
that they just give up hope. And I think that's the difference between your story and the average foster child that may end up in teen pregnancy or in jail, or even the suicide rates among foster children are astronomical. And I think that we just have to be very careful how we treat each other.
Mm-hmm.
And, I try to remember and try to remind myself daily, the way that I treat somebody might determine the rest of their life.
Absolutely. There are people who have said one-word phrases to me that I have remembered forever.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of impacts that we make on people, especially in a position like me as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they will remember what you say.
Absolutely. Well, it's been good to have you with us today, Michaela, and what a story. What a story. Tell us, how could people find you on social media if they wanted to contact you?
I am on Facebook, Michaela McAllister. I'm also on Instagram. I think it's michaela.leanne16. That's kind of the funny thing too. I just changed my name I've had 4 names.
Yes, I was keeping count there.
When I go to the pharmacy, they think I've been divorced a million times. But yeah, it's Michaela McAllister now. You can also email me, especially if you're in care and you just need someone to talk to who understands. Because, a lot of those emotions and going through the waves, it's really hard to talk to people unless they know what's going on. Yeah, I've had so many instances where just a conversation has changed my perspective. But yeah, you can email me at michaela.mcallister1208@gmail. And yeah.
All right, we'll make sure to list that all in the description of this podcast, and information with the Call of Arkansas and the Adoption Coalition's national. All right, I'm Doc Bryan, and you can find all of my social media at my website, thedocbryan.com. At the bottom, there's a social media link bar. You can find me everywhere, literally everywhere. Of course, Doc Talks is a part of the Be Frank Network. You can check out all of our podcasts there at befranknetwork.com. Michaela, once again, thank you for being here and telling your story.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, everybody, goodbye, and we will talk to you next time.